take a seat up here, and I'll invite them to share a couple of short stories in the interest of time.
Here you go, Luther. Thank you. You're up first.
Here, can I?
Oh, here's it. Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we have Reverend Luther Felder, who is, could you remind me your title?
Chaplain.
Chaplain?
Campus pastor. Yeah.
Campus pastor. Campus pastor at Payne College, and Ken Guest, who is our board president for the World Christian Federation in the U.S. And I would love to invite both of you to share a story about how your involvement in the student Christian movement was impactful as in your formation as a young adult into the adult you became. And if you could also name the group that you were actually involved with, because there were some names that Owen named that Charlotte talked about, and as I said, the student Christian movement has had different iterations, so it's just helpful to have those names. Yes. So, Reverend Felder, would you like to start?
I would. And I'm grateful for the opportunity. Let me just say that I have to say that at the age of 8 years old, I've only heard my father cry twice in my life, cry audibly. The first time was when his sister died. The second was when he received a phone call. My family received a phone call when I was 8 years old from my brother, who was a student at Clark Atlanta University, Clark College at that time, that he was getting ready to go on a freedom ride into Alabama. I took that as a call to arms because my mother took me with her to a grocery store, and I climbed up on the only water fountain and drank out of it and slipped and fell, and the store manager came after me. My mother grabbed me by the hand, took me out of that store. I haven't seen the inside of that store ever again in my life. The point is that sometimes that formation takes place because of somebody who sees or hears something. I later became a student at Wiley College in Marshall, Texas, and was elected to president of the Methodist Student Movement. Nobody really knew what that was because the chaplain had gone off to get a doctorate and he was not there, and people were standing in and didn't know what a Methodist Student Movement was. So I knew what a Wesley Foundation was, at least I thought I did, but I didn't know what a Methodist Student Movement was. I went to different conferences looking for what a Methodist Student Movement was, and later that catapulted me into involvement in the student Christian movement, which was the Methodist Student Movement, which was the Methodist Student Movement of the 1960s. The period that she's talking about just preceded the time that I talked about. When I came into the Methodist Student Movement, the Methodist Student Movement was about to vote itself out of existence, as was the Presbyterian and the Disciples and the UCC and other denominations were voting themselves out of existence so that we may form one Christian student movement, the University Christian Movement. At the University Christian Movement start, I was fortunate to be elected to its steering committee, and we went to our first steering committee meeting in, I can't remember the year, I think it may have been 1968, 67, 68. We went to the steering committee meeting in Washington, D.C. All of the African American students stayed at Howard University, Wesley Foundation, and we all hung out there. And when we stayed there, and when we went to the student movement meeting, it appeared as though the student movement that existed, the University Christian movement, had become a microcosm, at least it appeared to those of us who were there, that there was no openness. The openness that we had missed in the world was taking place, or was not being manifested in this new movement that we all had hoped for. And so the University Christian movement voted itself out of existence. Therefore, there was no Wesley Foundation, there was no Presbyterian campus ministry, there was no Episcopalian. And so it changed the dynamic on the national scale. Somehow there were still persons who helped to make those ministries happen, but there was no student movement. It wasn't until 1988 that the United Methodist student movement, the United Methodist. Remember I said MSM, Methodist Student Movement. Now with the United Methodist Church, and became the United Methodist Student Movement, came into existence. And that organization, I happened to have the opportunity to speak to that group as we were organizing for that, as they were organizing the students for that activity, for that program. And several years later, I became the Assistant General Secretary for Campus Ministry, following in the footsteps of Don Shockley, who was the person who reorganized the United Methodist Student Movement. And I got to work with Sue and several, Sue Rothmeyer and a number of other persons who were active in the student movements, and those active in at least the denominational leaders in trying to help create student movement. Let me just say this last thing. And, student movement, students, I found a new place in my role as a part of the student movement. That new place was to help to create a new generation of Christian student leader. And many of those young people who were active especially in the steering committee in the United Methodist Student Movement, are now active in delegations to General Conference, the General Conference that voted to split the church, because we insist that the church be open to whoever has gifts that they may serve. They are leaders in delegations to General Conference, leaders in annual conferences, leaders in various other places. And so the work we're doing now, I see raising a new generation of people who will speak truth to power.
Amen.
And will become that power source. I wore this hat today as a contradiction. It's a contradiction to what we're talking about, because every day I ride around on a golf cart with billionaires. And my aim is to help them to see paying college as a viable option for some of the billions that they spend. Ironically, few do. And so I want to say to you that you have a responsibility. It's going to be a delicate dance, but it's an important dance, because the future of the world depends on, especially with the way that voting rights are being overturned and shattered, voting opportunities are being destroyed, and the effort to reclaim or to claim a unilateral authority in this nation and in the world, it's appalling. And it's just like the time of the Crusades. The Crusades have started again, and they are going back to the Middle East, and they are creating havoc in the lands of other peoples. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Luther. Also one of my mentors in all of this. My name's Ken Guest. I'm a professor of cultural anthropology at Baruch College, the City University of New York. I've had a pretty a great career as an anthropologist, and I'd just like to say my whole career, both my teaching and my writing, has been shaped by my experiences with the student Christian movements, the World Student Christian Federation. I'll also just say a few words about that. I have a textbook, and the themes through it are about being transformed through field work by getting out of your cultural framework, living someplace else, learning languages, about engaging the global, and an analysis of power. And those things I learned through the student Christian movement and my engagement with the WSCF. So I was a student at Columbia in 1985, and we took over the administration building for 6 weeks to demand the university's divestment in South Africa. And my campus minister, Scott Matheny, also on our board, was there every day for us. And he brought us huge buckets of soup from the soup kitchen, and organized people to come teach us protest songs. And the first time I was ever arrested was marching with students from Columbia and Union Theological Seminary from Columbia down to the South African consulate and blockading the South African consulate. And that was the spring of 1985. So that was quite a learning experience about how you put your body. Like, I was handcuffed and put in a paddy wagon and hauled off, and I thought, okay, this is what we do. I studied Chinese. I ended up in Hong Kong working for the Methodists, and I was invited in 1986 to an international conference in Nanjing, China, to help do translation work. It was a big international missionary conference. China was just reopening, and the churches in China were trying to rebuild partnerships with churches around the world. And so there were 150 people there from all over the world. And one night, somebody from the WSCF said, anybody who's ever had a WSCF experience, we're going to meet after dinner in this room. And I walked in at least 100 people in that room from all over the world and from the US. And they went around and told all their stories. And I thought, wow, what happened to me? Like, there wasn't this structure. Luther talked about the voting out of existence of the University Christian movement in 1968. And when I was a student in the 1980s, there was no framework for this. We're just starting to begin to think again about how to do that. But those folks who were at that conference had gone through the experiences in the 50s, the 60s, and they had their whole framing of the world shaped by the student Christian movement and their engagement internationally with the WSCF. And somehow that really has always stuck with me. Like, I dream again that this generation of students can have that experience that I missed. But maybe I've been trying to recreate all along the way. I went to work for the United Methodist Global Mission Agency. I had a chance to work with student Christian movements all around the world, the WSCF, that was my portfolio. Those personal encounters transformed my life. After being arrested in New York around divestment in South Africa, I was able to be part of a delegation of WSCF folks who went to South Africa in 1991, before Mandela was released, and we went into local communities and worked to gather young people from all the different political movements into the same room to sit and talk about what peace would look like. People who had been fighting each other and shooting each other, and to spend time just trying. So that's the kind of space that this kind of ecumenical work can create. I'll just say my last piece is that I was very inspired by Elam's talk today. One of the things that he said, the people we come from have not been defeated. And that's part of the way I think about this movement is today we welcome you all into it, right? But it is something we've experienced for generations, and there were generations before us. So Owen has spent time in the Yale archives. I've spent a lot of time in the last 4 or 5 years doing my research about my grandparents, who went as Methodist missionaries to India in 1926, educational missionaries, but they ended up getting thrown out 5 years later by the British because they had gotten to be colleagues and friends and supporters of the young, radical Indian nationalists, the generation below Gandhi, who were not quite sure that civil disobedience was the only way. And that at all costs, they believed they had to get rid of British. So my grandparents got thrown out of India because of their commitment out of their social gospel beliefs and their own teachings in the student Christian movement and youth movements in the US of anti-colonialism, of partnership with people around the world, of solidarity with those movements. So when we think back about the missionary movement, I think it's really important that we don't put a really smooth gloss to say everybody was an imperialist and a colonialist, but actually I have letters from my grandfather writing about his frustration because the older missionaries, they just came to bring the scriptures and read the Bible. But his generation, they were motivated by the social gospel to do justice, to accompany the people of India. My son and I traveled back about 2 years ago to India, and we visited some of these places. And one of the touching things I heard was this word of thanks to my grandparents who came to accompany the liberation struggle there. They went on to live in the Philippines, they traveled in China, and they became very active in anti-colonialism work with Japanese colonialism of China. And I will note that in 1937 in Shanghai, they met with mission workers from around the world who were working at the YMCA and the YWCA in collaboration with their local Christian partners in China, and there was a very strong queer community, a very strong queer Christian community. I think that's really important for us to know that 90 years ago, this was just part of being a Christian, of doing the work, of being who they were. My grandfather and my grandparents were surveilled by the Japanese and imprisoned by the Japanese, and my grandfather died in a prison camp in the Philippines, partly because of his radical activism. So these people's stories are our stories, and they inspire me in this work. I hope in our little bit of time today we've given you a sense of the incredible journey of your Christian, progressive, radical, activist forebearers who have laid the groundwork for this, that have been called to wrestle prophetically, as Elam said, toward liberative futures. That's not new. That's generation after generation of people who have been engaged in that work. So welcome to it. And really so excited to be here in a space with you all.
All right. Thank you, Reverend Felder.
Luther has one last comment.
Oh, yes.
It was interesting that as a part of my being a part of this, I became a part of the National Council. The National Council of Methodist Student Movement. What was left of it was the students who served on boards and agencies of the church. I used to go to Board of Missions meetings and with a smile on my face and leave in tears because the board said, Luther, we can't do that. Randy Nugent became the executive director of the general secretary of that agency and later changed the agency to become more open to doing the things that were critical. And saying, whatever contribution you can make, doesn't have to be major. As I said, I was a member of that board. I cried like a baby at every meeting. Practically, Kane Hope Felder, who was who became the first executive director of BMCR, invited me to New York I came to New York to meet him because I was going to be on his staff. We went to Boston where he was ordained in the church, and then we went to Atlanta to organize that meeting. It was amazing to see how he and a group of students had locked up the God Box, 475 Riverside Drive. Union and Columbia students had done that. This was in 1968, and 69 rather. And he said, why didn't you come to the meeting? Because I was a member of that board, or member of the executive committee. They had sent my telegram, y'all don't know what that is, do you? They sent my telegram to Memphis to Jim Lawson. I had worked for Jim Lawson the summer before, and they had my address as Jim Lawson's church in Memphis, and I did not get the message. But that year, we were able to put the manifesto that James Foreman had done, put it before the Methodist Church, before the Methodist Board of Missions. And out of that, a lot of good was done. Dow Chemical Company, that was against the war in Vietnam. Dow Chemical Company that made napalm we took the money, investment from Dow Chemical Company and a host of other things, and that investment went to start some very important missions in the church.
One last story, Ailey, sorry. So it's a piece of the history you all should know about also. The student volunteer movement that Owen mentioned, 1888 it was started. Its last two conferences, 1955 and 1957, were held in Athens, Ohio, and they were intentionally interracial and international. 1959, Martin Luther King was one of the keynote speakers. While he was speaking, Jim Lawson was working the crowd. There were a couple thousand students there, and they were developing the strategy for the lunch counter demonstrations. There was a study that was done after a decade later that showed that in every lunch counter demonstration that was held throughout the South, there was at least one person who had been at that Athens, Ohio conference. So this is also a deep part of our history and deep part of our legacy.
Right.
And we are rebuilding that movement now.
Yes.
And we want you all to be part of it, not just this weekend, but into the future. And I think an important note is that a movement isn't just a few people, it's many, many people. I'm sure many of the people who went to that conference were, they didn't show up to the lunch counter sit-ins, they didn't go to the bus boycott, but they had their minds changed or they had their horizons expanded, and that creates cultural change. So however you show up in this movement, we need you. And we hope that we can be on this journey with you for a lifetime. Not just when you're students or young adults, but into the future when you are the ones forming the young adults and students of the future generations. So thank you to Reverend Felder and to Ken for giving us this historical context. We've had a bit of a marathon morning, but we have a little bit more to do.